Okay, so let's start. Welcome back to our international lecture series from our visualization and visual analytics technical committee of CSIG. This is the 10th, okay, actually it's the 10th lecture. So it's also the first lecture after Spring Festival. So welcome back from our Spring Festival. So we are still actually half of in the Spring Festival, the holiday, but now we start today in actually very interesting topic. Today we have an honor to invite our speaker, Professor Tim Dwyer from Monash University. Professor Tim Dwyer, actually he's a very famous on his recent work on this immersive visual analytics. Some people may already read some of paper from his group, and especially since the last year, people all talking about the metadata, and although like from the academic world, we have a different view for this, but it's true, like people are more aware about what is going to happen in those immersive or virtual world. So this is also a very important topic for visualization and visual analytics. Professor Tim Dwyer, he graduated from Sydney University, 2005. His advisor is actually Peter is. So Peter is already in China and give lectures, also gave talks in our summer school a few times. A lot of our audience are very familiar with Peter is. Professor Tim Dwyer, after graduate, he worked in Monash University as a postdoc for a few years, then later visit the research department of Microsoft, and then later also worked in the Microsoft Visual Studio as a software developer engineer, and then later he come back to Monash University and as doing the research, working on data visualization and immersive visualization. So let's just let me cut short on the introduction. So let's give more time to Professor Tim Dwyer. Let's go to see what's going to happen in future connected world and how immersive visual analytics can bring us something exciting. So let's welcome Professor Tim Dwyer. Let me switch the sharing.
Okay. Is that coming through okay?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much for this introduction, Professor Yuan. I am very pleased and honored to be invited to speak in this series. And I'm only sorry that I couldn't come to visit Beijing in person. It's funny seeing this globe up on the screen right now. We do live in a very connected world, but we can't physically move ourselves around the way that we could a couple of years ago. So yeah, there's a lot happening over there in Beijing at the moment. I know the Olympics are on as well. So if anybody is watching sports events in another window, I totally understand. Yeah, thank you very much. And without any further ado, I think I'll get into it. This is this talk is a bit of a retrospective of research, my own and also others in our group at Monash. And it's bringing together two topics that are really very close to my heart. The immersive analytics is the one that Xiaoru just mentioned earlier. using emerging display and interaction devices to visualize data in the world around us. And the connected world part is referring really to the work I've done previously in network visualization, which is where I want to start. So networks can be used to model all kinds of data. In fact, pretty much any kind of data, if you're interested in the relationships between different entities within the data, then you can model it as a network. They're commonly used, for example, in biology to visualize, in this case, what we see on the screen here is a metabolic pathway. So modeling a process, a chemical reaction process inside a living organism. So on the left, we see a version of the diagram that's been drawn by hand, the way that a biologist has arranged it in order to show certain features. For example, there's functional partitions, these yellow and green regions, each sort of interesting subreaction networks in their own right. You can see that various pathways have been straightened out to kind of highlight the flow within the network, which tends to be kind of from left to right in this case. On the left is a very important feature, which is this cycle. So obviously in living organisms, cyclical reactions that operate as machines continuously performing some process are very important. And so highlighting them in a way that the largest path through the cycle is arranged on the straight edges of a rectangle is a nice way to highlight that property. So this is a hand-drawn diagram on the left, and on the right is the result of an automatic layout that was applied. And this so-called stress majorization layout is a method that we developed at Monash, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about that in a moment. But first, I wanted to just give you a few more motivating examples of why I think that network visualization and network analytics is so important in understanding the world around us. So this is one example from a few years ago. There was the famous Panama Papers leak, which was a leak of private papers from a wealth management company called Mossack Fonseca. And what it revealed to the world was just how complicated some of the world's most wealthy and powerful peoples, just how complicated some of their financial arrangements are. And that some of this complexity is deliberately designed to hide their wealth from the world's tax authorities. And so this website, projects.icij.org, Panama Papers, is a set of visualizations or a visualization system that's been made available of the underlying data by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. And it's a really interesting site to sort of explore. You can go and look at this page and explore the data for yourself and see some of this complexity. And they've done a lot of the analysis in advance. So you can see some of the stories about certain individuals and what they're doing with their wealth management. So it's the relationships between individuals and corporations and bank accounts. So this is a very interesting website, a very interesting use case. And this kind of analysis has actually, in recent years, helped the world's governments to reclaim, at last I read, over $1.6 billion in taxes. Yeah, it's worthwhile to address inequality and solve some of the crime that happens in the world, the financial crime that happens in the world. And I think it's a very interesting example of using network visualization to explore some of these hidden relationships that exist in the world around us. In this particular case, I'm not a huge fan of the actual algorithms they use to arrange these visualizations and the techniques. I think they leave it quite cluttered. But that's the subject of the next part of this talk. Okay, here's another really interesting example, also not from me, but from, in this case, Professor Ricardo Hausman from Harvard University in the United States. This is a visualization of the so-called Atlas of Economic Complexity, which is a mapping of the so-called product space of the world's economy. That is, each of these nodes represents a product that's produced in various places around the world, and a connection exists between two products if there's similarities in the kind of know-how or expertise that's required, or infrastructure that's required to produce the two products together. And what's interesting about this is how the kind of clusters and outliers emerge. And what I've done in this particular visualization, so again, this is a website that you can play with for yourself. And there's a number of controls that you can experiment with to highlight different types of products, and also in this case, different countries. So I've highlighted actually the products produced by Australia. And what's interesting when you set it to color the nodes belonging to products produced in the US or Europe or indeed China, what you see is lots and lots of nodes light up on this central kind of set of clusters in this really dense region in the middle of the graph. For Australia, though, what we see, and they tend to be sort of advanced manufactured goods. What we see for Australia, though, is the nodes that light up on the periphery of the graph, and they are lots of primary produce, things like agricultural products, but the really big ones are mining products. So this is really what powers Australia's economy, is petroleum, coal, and iron ores and concentrates, various other minerals as well. I think the brown ones are all minerals. And so it's good for us that we have these great big nodes, so we're able to sell lots of these products overseas. It's a bit sad for me as a technologist, though, that we don't produce more interesting, more advanced technologically products. And in some ways, I'm a bit jealous of countries like the US and China and Europe for that reason. Anyway, here's another example. So this is an example from the group directed by Mauro Martino at IBM Watson Cognitive Visualization Lab. So this work shows how different species of plants, each of the nodes here is a different plant, how they're linked by codependence on different species of ants. So there's a link between two plants if they have a codependence on a certain type of ant. And what's down the bottom here, what we see is how the population of the ants, so the numbers of ant species, as they diminish, how the numbers of what plant species die out. And what we find is that generally the network is pretty robust. It can tolerate the loss of quite a lot of ant species, but at a certain point, when there's too many species lost, then the whole network kind of collapses. Too many links drop out, and the plants no longer, the ecosystem falls apart. The really alarming thing, though, is that with the effects of global warming and climate change, that places a lot of extra stress on this complex system, and this threshold is much higher. So we can afford to lose a lot fewer species before the whole system collapses. So that's bad news, and this visualization is really quite effective in driving home this message. It's a complex message, but quite powerfully visualized here. And hopefully the visualization will help these scientists convey the message that that preserving diversity of species in ecosystems like this is really, really important, and we have to do more to maintain it. So those last couple of examples, I think, were perhaps not the most optimistic examples, especially not the last one. This one is more of a good news story. Well, I guess it's all good news in the fact, in the idea that if we can tell these stories effectively and help people to understand these problems, then we can do something to fix them. So that's the good news. This is a genuine good news story. So this is this is another network. In this case, it's biologists who are beginning to understand the complex relationships between bacteria in the microbiome. So microbiome systems of bacteria, either inside us, inside our guts, or in the soil, and both of these are very important. Healthy microbiome is very important to inside us, inside our bodies. It's very important to our health. And similarly, a healthy microbiome in soil is very important to effectively growing plants and crops. And with our increased understanding of these systems, we are learning, for example, that there are so-called keystone taxa, that is very important species of bacteria that you can either encourage the growth of these bacteria to strongly influence the robustness of the network, or if they're causing problems, then you can knock them out and have a significant positive effect potentially. So again, network visualization. So the keystone taxa are the dark nodes here. And again, network visualization really helping us to understand these complex systems. And this is really only in the last couple of decades that biologists have really made inroads into understanding these complex systems. All right, so hopefully, I think there's countless examples really of how we could model the world around us through networks. And I think it's really important that we advance, that we, and you, my audience, as researchers or research students who are interested in visualization, that we make progress in developing better and better techniques to help people to understand networks. I think it's vital. This is not just my work. Here's just some of the collaborators, some of the co-authors on some of the papers that I'm going to present. And I'm really grateful and have really enjoyed working with them over the years. All right, back to this example of the metabolic pathway network. I just realized I should probably be watching the chat in case there are questions coming through. So let me bring up the chat window. We're good now. Please don't be afraid to interrupt. Don't be afraid to ask questions, and I'll try and keep an eye on this chat window. I'm happy to pause and answer them rather than just continuing on. All right. So back to this metabolic pathway diagram. This was the hand-drawn diagram again with a number of features, drawing conventions that I pointed out before, the straightened pathways, the functional partitions, the cycle, and so on. And this was our layout obtained by applying this constrained stress majorization layout algorithm. Okay, now let me tell you what that's all about. So firstly, stress majorization is a method for given a network like this, finding positions of the nodes in the network such that, well, actually this stress function here gives us a measure of how distorted these edges are, how much they've been stretched away from some ideal length. So each of these edges, the line between pairs of nodes, each of these edges has a comfortable ideal length. It might be, for example, a unit 1. And that's this Dij term here. And when you can measure the actual length of the edge in the diagram as the Euclidean distance between a pair of nodes, in this case, the x and y coordinates of the ith node and the x and y coordinates of the jth node. So the stress function measures the squared differences in edge lengths and their ideal desired length, with some weighting term that you can use to balance out the contributions to this term from long edges and short edges, for example, which I won't get into. Anyway, the important thing is that this is actually quite a complicated function. This is just a conceptual drawing of what this stress function would look like across different possible positions of the node. And it's highly non-convex. There's lots of peaks and valleys, making it quite a hard optimization problem, quite a hard problem to find the lowest stress configuration, where we hope that the lowest stress configuration corresponds to a nice layout of the network. But there are techniques we can use to iteratively reduce the stress. The technique that stress majorization employs is to bound the overall stress function from above by some quadratic function. So, and you take turns across the horizontal position variables and the vertical position variables. So these two terms here, one is a quadratic function bounding the positions, the stress in terms of the x positions of the nodes, and the other one is in terms of the y positions. So minimizing first for the x positions, we see that the network kind of relaxed a little bit across some of the edges, some of the most stretched edges. And then we switch to minimizing this curve, the quadratic term for the y position variables, and it relaxes further. And then we switch back to x and y and so forth until as we see, it's become a lot more untangled. Now, that may not be a global optimum, a global minimum. Rather, it's highly probable that we'll descend into a so-called local minimum, one of these valleys. But there are techniques there are heuristics for finding good starting points and that sort of thing. Anyway, this was not our invention. This is a technique that people have been using to lay out networks without constraints for quite a long time. And before that, actually, statisticians and psychologists used it to find projections of high-dimensional data in scatter plots, so-called multi-dimensional scaling. Anyway, our contribution was to introduce an approach to minimize such a stress function subject to certain constraints. And so we can see conceptually that constraints forbid solutions from part of the, that we can choose in our final configuration. And again, so this is the infeasible, this is the feasible region, the part of the solution space that we're allowed to choose, and the purple part is the infeasible solution, and this is the constraint boundary here. And again, we can do this kind of sequential quadratic solving, but subject to the constraints, so sequential quadratic programming. And at the end, we're going to finish up with a solution in the feasible region, possibly hard up against a constraint boundary, as we see here. So the question then, though, is what do these quadratic forms actually look like, and how do we solve them? Well, I won't get into it too much, but the quadratic forms are similar to the ones that I showed you before for the unconstrained problem. And we can imagine that solving an individual quadratic program similar to the example I showed you before for the overall stress function, we have an infeasible region, this purple region, and a feasible region, and we want a solution from inside this blank part of the solution space. And it's like, for a single quadratic form, it's actually pretty trivial. You can think of it like dropping a marble into a bowl, and the marble rolls downhill or in the direction of steepest descent. And so we get that from the derivative of the quadratic form fairly trivially. We can compute the optimal step size with respect to that steepest descent direction, and that gives us a new feasible solution. And we keep going until at some point we may cross the constraint boundary, in which case we project, that is, we project back to the constraint boundary, that is, we find the closest point on the constraint boundary to the direction we were trying to step. And we continue on in that way until we converge to a position on the constraint boundary. All right, if you're not really interested in maths, I apologize for the last few slides, that's really it. I guess the important point, though, is that what we're using here are really quite well understood, well-founded optimization techniques. And so they give us very stable layout that we can obtain subject to certain constraints. And the particular class of constraints that we first experimented with were these so-called separation constraints, or constraints over pairs of position variables in either the horizontal or vertical axes. The reason we choose these is that this particular class of constraints is they're very powerful, as we'll see in a minute, but we can also solve them very efficiently. And so powerful in the sense that we can do things like removing all the overlaps or avoiding overlap between node boxes in our drawing. So here I've defined a separation constraint preventing nodes from sliding over each other horizontally, and another one to prevent them sliding over each other vertically. And when I perform the constrained optimization, as we saw before, to the stress function subject to these sets of non-overlap constraints, we get a nicely spaced out diagram like this one here. And we can do lots of other things too. So here we can see that we have required all the directed edges in this drawing to point downwards. Some parts of the network we've forced certain pathways to be aligned, and we can do things like adding page width constraints to keep it inside the borders of the page, and the non-overlap constraints that I mentioned before. Also, we can integrate, it's a bit tricky, it's a bit fiddly, but we can also integrate the edge routing into the layout process. So we can treat the edges like rubber bands that bend around nodes, but also push back against the nodes to help spread everything out nicely. And it's interactive too. So the reason I sort of detailed the iterative nature of the algorithm before was to show that, so that perhaps you can imagine how it can be applied incrementally. For example, in this interactive diagramming editor that we built, this is a while ago, back in 2008, you're able to both manipulate the nodes in the diagram, drag them around and have the layout respond continuously, but also you can manipulate the edge routing, as I said before, with these using constraints to integrate the boundaries, like also not just edges, but also boundaries around groups of nodes. We can treat them like rubber bands that are impermeable and stretch around the nodes and keep the regions separate. And perhaps I'll jump ahead at this point. Oh, actually, I will jump ahead to the end of this video, because the end of this video shows the construction, the set of constraints we used in this metabolic pathway drawing that I showed you before. So you can see here that we have alignment constraints to straighten out certain pathways and to keep the cycle that I mentioned before, the nodes in the cycle aligned to the borders of a rectangle. We have flow constraints to keep the edges all pointing more or less in a uniform direction, and also these rubber band boundaries to keep the functional components of this network separate from each other. All right. So this was work, as I said, done prior to about 2008. At that point, I went to Microsoft, as Professor Yuan mentioned before, where I worked to integrate these kind of layout algorithms into the Visual Studio product. So to create tools to allow developers to see the relationships between elements of computer code, of elements of programs, or that is to visualize dependencies within code. So this visualization you see here, it did eventually ship as a product called CodeMap in about 2012, and the design process for this tool. So when I joined Microsoft, I thought it was going to be fairly straightforward. Just I would implement all the algorithms I knew, and once we had the capability to visualize code as networks, developers would be thrilled and they would use it all the time. But I was very naive. What I learned actually is that it was a a long and very interesting, but also a difficult process of usability engineering to find out how best to incorporate diagrams like this into an interactive tool, an integrated development environment. And perhaps I'll show you an example of that in a minute. First, though, I'll also say that a lot of the algorithms that I've been talking about already are available. So a lot of my work at Microsoft went into closed source code at Microsoft, but I've also since implemented it in an open source JavaScript library that you can use in your web pages to create dynamic visualizations in your web pages. So that's available on GitHub, and that's the homepage up there. Okay, so this is the example of a scenario that motivated us to develop this visualization tool, this code maps tool in the Visual Studio development environment. And so imagine that we are programmers and we're trying to debug a piece of software. In this case, it's a little game. It's the Tetris game. And the issue is that at a certain point, this game is going to crash. And the problem is it's one of the worst kind of crashes, most difficult to debug in that it's non-deterministic. There's some randomness in when it occurs, which makes it difficult to reproduce. It has, however, just crashed. And what it's telling us is, so this is Visual Studio's standard procedure, standard behavior when there's a crash in a program that's being run against the debugger, is it's going to highlight a line of code and say that, oh, there's some sort of exception has been thrown that we couldn't recover from. In this case, it's because this figure variable was a null reference. So for some reason, this figure parameter to this function wasn't set up properly. And what we can do with the Visual Studio environment is we can explore outwards from, what we can do with the code map tool is we can explore outwards from this problem area here. We can add first that variable that we're interested in as a node in our diagram, which is what we see down here. So this is the draw preview function, and in particular, this figure parameter to the function. And then we can visually explore the references, how that function was called, which takes us back to this preview paint function. And eventually, what we find, which would be difficult to do just by looking through, for example, a stack trace, what we find is that there is a place in the code where figures are created. The next figure that's produced that you see on the screen as a player is created. And in this case, it's creating a whole lot of different shapes. And we see in this diagram that one of the shapes is not set up the same way as the others. It's not set up in this get next figure function. So the square is visually quite different to the others. So that's a good clue that we go in, and we're then able to go in and add the required case to this get next figure. So that's a kind of bottom-up exploration of a fairly, you can imagine that in a significant piece of software, actually the whole network would be very, very large. This is just a very small slice of the set of relationships between code elements. But the whole network could be very, very large and much too large to visualize in one go. This is a bottom-up exploration where we explore the network from the tiniest pieces moving outwards. Another way that you might want to do it, though, is a sort of top-down approach, starting with the highest level components in the software and drilling in. And that's in fact what we tried first. But what we learned very quickly is that you can quickly overwhelm developers when you show them too much stuff on the screen at once. And so in this case, this is a visualization of the top level components, the different libraries involved in a Python implementation. So each of these nodes is a separate library. This brown node down here, it's kind of a miscellaneous bucket. So it's called externals. And if you drill in there, there'll be a whole lot of system level dependencies that aren't really part of our code, but we do require to be around. What we've found visualizing graphs like this. This is not a huge network. It's only got, a couple of dozen nodes, but already there's a lot of lines, there's a lot of dependencies, and already it's kind of overwhelming. It's difficult to really see what's going on. One thing that you realize fairly quickly when you look at it a bit more closely, though, is that there is a line from every one of these blue nodes to this brown node. So really, that's not a lot of lines to convey a fairly simple piece of information, which is that every element of our system depends on some sort of external library, which is not really news. Most programs are going to make use of, most useful programs are going to make use of system level libraries. So we can represent that piece of information much more simply by drawing a box around all the blue nodes and just saying, well, with a single arrow, that all the stuff inside this box depends on externals. So we've removed, I don't know, what about 15 edges just by doing that, and reduced the complexity of the lines in this diagram quite significantly. And now we can see more clearly which of these nodes depend on which other nodes. But we can go further. We can inside these blue nodes, we can find sets of nodes that all have similar relationships to other nodes and put boxes around those as well. And what we finish up with is a much simpler diagram indeed. So we've gone from really many, it's been a while since I counted the number of lines in this diagram, several dozen lines. We've gone from several dozen lines to just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But it's exactly the same information as before. We haven't really lost any information at all. And so this is actually, there's a term for this kind of grouping. It's called a modular decomposition. In this work, in this paper here, though, we went a bit further and we developed a technique that worked not only when there are sets of nodes that have precisely the same relationships as other nodes, but fuzzier matches as well. So here we have a little network with 23 edges. I can identify the fact that nodes B and D have exactly the same set of external dependencies. So I can draw a box around B and D exactly as we did before. And then their relationships with the outside world are subsumed in these lines coming in and out of the box. We can go further still, though. We can find another box around A, E, and C. So they also have the same relationships with the outside world. And now all the relationships between A, E, and C and the stuff inside this box is summarized in this single arrow here. And there's another relationship with F. But we can go further still if we allow for some of these links to pass over the boundaries of boxes. But there's a question, this is a little bit subtle now. Can people actually understand these relationships? And in a piece of work I did with Natalie Reisch from Microsoft Research, we did a study where we had people perform tasks like find the shortest path from the node marked start to the node marked end using this diagram. And so to do this, they would have to realize that the shortest path to get there would be to go from this box containing the start node to D. And then from D, they had to find a way into this other box. And they could do that following either G or E. Let's follow G. And then from now we're inside this box. Remember that inside a box, there's no relationship between a pair of nodes inside the box unless one is actually drawn. So actually they can't get from G directly to end. First, they have to go back across this line, and now they can get to I, and from I, they can get back to N. So the answer to the question, what's the shortest path? What's the length of the shortest path from start to end is 1, 2, 3, 4. Which once you know how to read these diagrams is much easier in a diagram like this than in an ungrouped network visualization. And we found that our participants were able to solve these problems more effectively in these kind of diagrams once they were trained in how to use them than in flat network diagrams. So this is one technique for reducing complexity. We did some more work experimenting with different ways to generate these groupings. It turns out to be actually quite a hard optimization problem. We found heuristics, though, that were really quite effective, and we were able to take really quite dense networks like this one on the left and clean them up a lot, like the one on the right. Okay, and here's what it looks like for that, that Tetris graph that I showed you before. We can perform the same kind of grouping. And then with my student Vahan, we used a so-called, well, it wasn't, we used actually sophisticated optimization, constrained optimization solvers to obtain this network you see on the right. So here we've required that all the nodes be strictly placed in a grid, which is a common design principle. And we've placed them within that grid to minimize the lengths of the nodes, but inside their functional groups. And so you finish up with quite a tidy drawing. And again, you can see that this square node now is really quite different to the others. The visualization conventions here really make it explicit that there's a different set of relationships to square than for the other shapes in our class hierarchy. Alrighty. Okay, I'm going to skip over that so that I can start talking about immersive analytics in a minute. This was a theme of my research for quite a few years, was how can you reduce the complexity of drawings like this. So this is a protein-protein interaction network, another kind of biological network. And these are often very dense, as we see on the right here. So this one has several thousand nodes and tens of thousands of links between the nodes. And what you finish up with is a hairball that is just kind of a mess. So this particular visualization, which is produced using a fairly standard so-called force-directed layout algorithm, it's actually not giving us a whole lot of information. We kind of see a dense cluster and then some outliers, but apart from that, we can't really read much detail at all. And arguably that's as much information as we get from this diagram. Although there's a lot of pixels used, a lot of different colors, you can't actually get that much information from it. So again, with Vahan, who has now graduated, we developed a completely different technique for visualizing network structure that scaled very well to large graphs, both in terms of runtime. So it was n log n in terms of runtime in the number of nodes and edges. And the approach here is to again do a type of decomposition. It's a different type of decomposition to the one we saw before. This one's a k-cause decomposition. Meaning that inside each of these circles, and the circles represent a group of nodes, and the size of the circle is dependent on how many nodes are within them. And each of the nodes represents each of the circles represents a set of nodes that have at least some specific number of relationships to the other nodes inside the circle, or k relationships, or a so-called k-core. And when you compute the k-cores across a whole graph up to an arbitrary depth, you get a hierarchy, which we've chosen to visualize using these kind of nested circle plots. And the colors correspond to the k value, the number of connections inside the component. And we use some of the other visualizations here, highlight the node degree distribution, and we summarize the number of nodes and the number of edges in the network. And we argue that that's a useful way to provide, at a glance, a gallery across a large set of large and complex networks. So here, for example, we see not just one protein-protein interaction network, but a whole bunch. So seven different organisms. That's the 7 rows in this matrix. And within each row, we see a different inference of the network using different algorithms over time. And so we can see the evolution of the networks as they're inferred by the algorithm. So at a glance summary of a large set of networks supporting a pretty good comparison of the structure within the network. So at least better than these hairball visualizations that we started with, and very easy to compute. Okay, further to this idea of reducing complexity, we did a study to really understand what the limits of visual complexity in networks are in terms of how big and complex a network can get before it becomes unreadable. To do this, we had a large number of people wear these EEG headsets, and using those headsets as well as other physiological measures like heart rate variability and pupil dilation using an eye tracker, and also subjective measures of their self-reported struggle or cognitive load, we were able to get an understanding. Well, we had them perform a bunch of these kind of shortest path tasks again, and we were able to see what the effect of size and complexity of the network on difficulty was. And what these little networks, what these little visualizations are showing us is that there's a real cutoff point when you have, for example, a density 2 network. Once you go beyond about 75 nodes, they become really, really difficult to work with. And higher density is even smaller, so maybe 50 nodes. And the other interesting thing was that when we look at the EEG data, for easy, simpler networks compared to difficult networks, as people were performing these tasks, we see that the easy networks light up different regions of the brain. So here, the psychologists that we worked with showed us that these different regions correspond to fairly basic navigation, whereas the regions that are lit up in the hard networks correspond to higher order functioning, such as short-term memory and spatial reasoning. Okay. Okay, so on to the other main thrust of research that I've been involved in the last few years, so-called immersive analytics. So again, a large number of people have contributed to this. This is just a few of them. Also, many people from different institutions. There are some overseas collaborators here, but there are many more actually. I'm very grateful to them again. Part of the inspiration for this work was that in 2014, Monash opened a so-called Cave 2 facility. You can see that here. So it was a large circular wall of almost completely surrounding the space inside. And so banks of LCD screens and very high resolution. And also you can see on top of each column of screens, there's an infrared tracking device. So we can track little headsets that people wear and know where they're standing inside the region and render a 3D view accordingly. You can see these are some very important people from our university saying how wonderful this center was. And we were given the opportunity to use it for our research. However, when the Cave 2 opened at Monash, these kind of facilities weren't as common or as popular as they once were. They were kind of going out of favor. And for example, in the visualization community, people were becoming very suspicious of 3D visualization, possibly because the first wave of 3D visualizations that came about in the late 90s, when the first relatively fast graphics cards became available, were all on desktops. So you saw lots of kind of gratuitous use of 3D graphics to try and visualize things without a lot of thought going into how it would benefit the users. So we struggled at first to find good uses for this, for visualizing abstract data. So for engineering models and things like that, big visualization centers that can give you a 3D perspective view of 3D models kind of make a lot of sense. But for the kind of abstract data that we are more interested in the information visualization community, things like networks or quantitative data, it's less obvious that a 3D perspective view can help you. So we used these screens just like a large display wall. And here's another visualization center actually next door to the cave facility. It's the so-called future control room. So well, it still is a facility that we use to work with energy companies, for example, to do studies of how we can improve the ergonomics of control room environments. And so it's a more standard visualization center. But again, I would argue that the future of visualization is not big display, not big visualization centers with large display walls and very expensive equipment like this. Rather, it's something more like this. So imagine a group of people. This is me and some of my colleagues. We're wearing glasses. Imagine that our glasses can give us a very accurately rendered, very stable view of arbitrary information graphics in the spaces and on the surfaces around us. Obviously, that's not actually what's happening here. We're just wearing our normal eyeglasses, and this is a Photoshop. But the concept is actually achievable now. So at the time we started this immersive analytics research in about 2014, the first VR headsets were becoming available, and a little bit after that, the first HoloLenses started from Microsoft, the first really quality consumer-grade augmented reality glasses became available for much lower cost than a cave. So I would argue that something like this is the future rather than the kind of visualization center we saw before. So visualizing data on surfaces or in the space around us. Okay, so what I'm going to show you now is a industrial situation where workers are confronted with a dangerous situation, and a 2D visualization is not really sufficient to help them solve the problem.
Remember, short controlled bursts. 8 meters. 7. 6.
Can't be, that's inside the room.
It's reading right, man, look. Well, you're not reading it right. 5 meters, man. 4. What the hell? Oh my God. Oh, give me the light.
Okay, so these are Space Marines in the movie Aliens. And with that little device there, that little 2D tracking device, they were trying to track the positions of movement of the aliens swarming around them. And at some point they realized that even though the tracker wasn't giving them the information, they realized that the aliens were already right on top of them, literally above them, running through the ceiling. So their 2D visualization didn't quite give them the information that they needed. Okay, so not a real industrial scenario, but I really like this movie. Okay. So the reason I show you this fun little video is because it was the inspiration for a chapter that we contributed to a book that I think is almost available finally now. It's called Mobile Data Visualization. And we had these little concept cartoons. This is literally a cartoon of the scenario we just saw. So the aliens using a 2D display device and being, the Space Marines using the 2D display device and being overrun by the aliens, which we reimagined what that scenario would be like if they had AR headsets. So they realize much more quickly that they're unprotected from above and that the aliens are sneaking up on them, and they're able to plan their escape using interactive visualization of the building model in all 3 dimensions, and they're able to escape. And then they do some abstract data visualization, because why not? And these headsets give them very large displays that they can do complex work with anywhere. And there's a joke there too that I won't get into. All right. So there's a lot of potential with these emerging display devices. And so we explored this a few years ago in 2018. This book came out introducing the topic of immersive analytics. And we explored it from a number of different angles, trying to set out the agenda for the research space. And you can see some of the big issues there that we explored, and a lot of, and you can have a look at the book to see a list of research questions that we put forward. And that was sort of the inspiration for some of the work that I'm going to show you in a minute. All right, so the first study that I want to mention was actually using this cave facility that I showed you before. And we were asking the question, well, is this really, really expensive cave facility, which cost about $2 million, by the way, even as good for collaborative visualization as these really cheap headsets? So this is the first generation Oculus Rift developer kits that came out in about 2015. And we ran about a dozen pairs of people through either the cave, working together to solve, again, shortest path tasks. Actually, that was kind of a theme in the research. So looking at visualizations of networks around them and trying to find the shortest path between pairs of nodes, and in either the cave or in the headsets. And we saw some interesting things. So in the headsets, we saw people's movement. So this is from above. This is the space of the visualization viewed from above. And we can see the two people moving around quite a lot. This is their field of regard on the wall. You can see the green person is sort of working more on one side, and the purple person, they're moving up and down quite independently. So they're able to work quite independently as well as working together in these headsets. In the cave, the picture is quite different though. So here we see the red person and the blue person. They move very closely together, and they're both looking at similar parts of the wall at the same time. And their vertical movements, only the red person is moving up and down. The blue person is not moving up and down at all. And the reason, actually, it's quite simple. The reason is that in our cave, only one person can actually have the view correctly rendered for their head position. The other person has an incorrect perspective view. And so to get a proper perspective view, they're forced to actually stand quite close to the other person. Otherwise, they'll see quite disturbing distortions and movements of the graph as the other person moves around. So, so they weren't able to work as independently. And as a result, we actually saw a difference in their task completion time. So they were actually able to work faster in the headsets, the very cheap headsets, than in the cave. All right, so since then, to cut a long story short, most of our work has been in VR or AR headsets.
Flow maps cannot scale to large data.
Sorry, this is my past student, Yilong Yang, speaking. He's now at Virginia Tech. He was from China originally. So he did a lot of work on map visualizations. And this is a set of techniques that he studied to explore links relationships on maps. So these are actually flow networks. So movements of goods or people across different regions in the geographic map. So world trade, for example, or world migration of people. And he had some really interesting results. Let me keep moving. Namely, actually, one of his most interesting findings was that these globe views of worlds, so actually drawing geographic data on a globe in the 3D space, was actually very effective compared to these kind of map projections. So having to artificially flatten a map is disruptive, and with VR, you don't have to do that. So it's quite interesting that in VR, people have been using globes for hundreds of years. Obviously, they've been representing the world on a physical globe on a desk for many years. But it's interesting that that sort of technology was superseded by flat maps that you would print out, firstly on sheets of paper that you would take on a ship, for example, or later on screens, on flat screens. So we were forced to do these kind of map projections. And it's interesting that in VR, we can bring back the authentic rendering of the globe in a really quite interactive and useful way. All right, moving on. This is another one of Yilong's techniques. This is Another interesting use of 3D for visualization, a technique called tilt map. The idea was that when you have geographic regions and you're interested in quantities associated with each of the regions, there's a couple of different ways you can visualize that information. One common method we see up here on the right is a so-called choropleth map, where you color the regions such that the color corresponds to the color hue or intensity corresponds to the quantitative value. An alternative is something like this, which is a so-called prism map, where you extrude the shape of the geographic region into the third dimension. Still another way is to forget about the geography altogether and simply visualize the different areas as bars in a bar chart. They each have different advantages and disadvantages. So the choropleth map, for example, gives you the best view of the geography. The bar chart gives you the most accurate way to read off values in the chart. And the prism kind of gives you certain advantages of both of these, but also but can also have a problem with occlusions. So sometimes these bars will make it difficult to see around to other bars. So the idea of this tilt map system is that you could you could tilt the map, and as you tilted it, it would actually change the representation dynamically. So the interaction was very simple. You grab it and tilt it towards you, and it changes shape to become more optimal for your view angle. So when you view it directly from above, it's a choropleth map. And when you view it from the side, it's a bar chart. And when you view it somewhere in between, if I can jump to the right place in this movie, you get a prism map like that, and with smooth transitions between them. Okay. I'm probably going to run out of time, so I'll try and wrap this up in about 10 minutes. So we've also built a number of systems for exploring data interactively, more freely and interactively, creating visualizations. This is a system from my student who's still going, Benjamin Lee. The system is called Fiesta. I'll show you the video, perhaps, make it obvious what's going on.
System exploring how novel events.
So we see here the study that Benjamin did involved groups of 3 people at a time in a co-located space with these VR backpacks. And what they're actually seeing is an immersive environment like this, where they can construct data visualizations and interact with them and move around them and pass them to each other and place them in the space around them. And you can see that happening here. And in his study, we tried different setups for the environment. For example, we allowed them, you saw the table before, we experimented with placing horizontal surfaces for them to position the data visualizations on, as well as using the walls. And by looking very closely at all the movements and construction of visualizations after the fact, we were able to see interesting patterns of collaboration and space use. And I think this is a really interesting and fertile field of research, is to understand the ergonomics of creating these kind of workplaces. So allowing people to structure their own knowledge work environments, as you see here, and what the ergonomics of that are, and how we can support that kind of behavior. Okay. Moving on. So another system that we built was the so-called IMAXes system. The concept of this was, imagine you have multi-dimensional data. So multi-dimensional data is everywhere. Even a bottle of wine has a lot of information associated with it. If you're a wine connoisseur or a chemist, you might be interested in properties like number of chlorides in the wine, density, acidity, and on, which you can visualize in a table. And traditionally, you might have done it that way. Or you might visualize all these dimensions in something like a scatter plot matrix. So each pair of dimensions in its own little scatter plot. or in a parallel coordinates plot. That is, each axis corresponds to a different data dimension, and a single line will be represented with a line, and where the line cuts through the different axes, that's the value of that line in that particular dimension. So I think looking at these, what you see, the commonality of these different types of visualization is that they both have an axis corresponding to a dimension in the data. Here, the axes are vertical, here they're horizontal and vertical. So our system uses the concept of the axis as the primary affordance for interaction, or rather an embodied interaction affordance. This is a concept that's been explored by people like Paul Dorish and Donald Norman, designers and HCI researchers. They've explored things like helping air traffic controllers to track the flight paths of planes using little strips of paper. And in an interactive system like this, that's actually adapting the workflow that these air traffic controllers are used to. They've been using these strips of paper for a long time, so they're very comfortable using that strip of paper as a physical embodiment of a plane's flight path and tracking it on boards like this. And so in the early 2000s, they made systems that preserved this physicality, but with electronic support. In VR, though, we have even more freedom to design our interfaces. And this is what we came up with. So the IMAXI system represents the set of dimensions in the data set as these axes bars that start up arranged on a kind of shelf. So this is a 12, 14 dimensional data set. And when you place the axes, the visualizations that appear depend on how the axes are placed relative to each other in the space around you. So we started off with scatter plot now, and then we've rearranged them to create a parallel coordinates plot. And you can do other things too. For example, here we've got sets of interlinked scatter plots. So it's sort of both a scatter plot and also a parallel coordinates plot. And we're arranging all of these visualizations in the space around us quite freely and easily. Okay, the interesting thing about this system is that from this simple concept, there were really a lot of interesting emergent interactions that we didn't design specifically, but we realized were easily available to us. So the different construction of the visualizations just by placing the axes in space, or more sophisticated things. Oops, sorry. I'll carry on. So it's quite a flexible system. In another study, we observed some economists using this system over time. So we allowed them to explore their own data, go away and come back. And after several sessions, we looked at the sets of visualizations they created and how they arranged them in the space around them. And we see interesting different patterns. A really common pattern actually is people creating visualizations, as we see in this diagram on the left, sort of in a circle around them. So it's interesting when you allow people to create their own displays, they tend to create these kind of circles. But of course, there's all sorts of reasons why they might be doing this. Perhaps they don't feel comfortable walking around in a VR headset. So especially when it's tethered, these are Vive headsets from a couple of years ago that had big, heavy cables coming out the back. And so perhaps people tended to just arrange the visualizations at arm's length from them, which led to these circles. So an interesting question actually is, what's the optimal arrangement for these kind of digital workspaces? We can do it any way we like, and we can support people in different arrangements. So should we arrange them in circles, or should we try something else? And that's another line of research that I'll talk about in a minute if I have time. This is another concept that we developed at Monash a little bit more recently. So it's actually inspired by the IMAXI's work, but this time we created a physical device for interacting with these axes, and they're kind of fixed. Their arrangement, one to the other, is this fixed 3 orthogonal dimensions. So it allows us to slice and dice spatial data, like those medical images that you saw there. And the sliders we can use for filtering operations. And the interesting thing about them actually is that these relatively cheap sliders, which come from mixing consoles in recording studios, each slider costs about $10. They actually have little motors attached to them, so you can actuate them and have them push back or give haptic feedback, which is quite useful. So you can see here, another use of the actuated motor is to, for example, have a fixed width slice. So you just move one slider and the other one follows. Or to do remote collaboration. So for example, we built 2 of these so-called physical axes devices, and we used it in a study with medical, I think they were chiropractic surgeons. We had them work with each other across different states. Actually, they were 1,000 kilometers apart, each using their own device. And when one would adjust the slider in one place, the slider would also move in the other location. So it became a physical embodiment of that person's interaction at a different location. Okay, perhaps I'll jump on from that to the next one. I might skip over that one too, although it's fun and it's sports related, but okay, this is a more recent work. For the last couple of years, we continued developing this concept, and we came up with an untethered wireless version of these axes controllers. And they can be placed anywhere in your environment. They have the same sliders, and here you can see them being used with HoloLens devices to produce this kind of IMAX's spatial grammar for composing these visualizations. And I think this notion of embodying data with a physical device, I think PowerPoint just crashed. That's fun. I apologize for that. Let me just start it up again. Oh no, perhaps I just got, okay, we're still going. Okay. Yeah, this notion of embodying data with physical proxies is very interesting, and I think very important, because as we generate more and more data in our society, through all the digitized operations, all the automation that we have, so much information about the world just disappears into computers, for example, in data centers like this one here. And what we want to do is bring the data out of the computers back into the world around us. We can put it on screens like the ones we saw before with standard kind of visualizations. But the screens are just like windows into this data world. They're not really bringing the data out in a way that we can interact with it using the skills that we have innately, the spatial navigation skills that we have innately to interact with and explore this data. And we've lost something in doing that. So we've embodied data physically for actually a very long time. You can see here these so-called tally sticks. So these are from the Middle Ages, these top ones, bits of wood or bone that people used to carve notches in to keep track of debts. They've been doing that. Actually, there's examples of these kind of tally sticks dating back to the Paleolithic era, so prehistory. Here's another example. An abacus is also a physical embodiment of number. I've got a question. This was actually a little while ago. I apologize, it's taking me 5 minutes to notice. How to do a user study for VR in the current pandemic situation? Yes, it's difficult. It is difficult, and it's sort of slowed us down a lot. Perhaps I'll come back to that at the end. It is an interesting question though. Okay, so abacuses embody number. Another example is slide rules. So slide rules were the computers that actually NASA engineers used to design rockets that took people to the moon. So they're very powerful embodiments of number that allow people to form complex calculations. And I think that these kind of embodiments, they allow you to think about number, both abacuses and slide rules and things, they allow you to think about quantitative values in data in a different way, in a more human way than we're able to by interacting with computers normally. Slide rules, for example, are not prone to typo errors. So on a calculator, you might press the wrong button and you wouldn't, at the end, you just get a number back. You don't have a feeling for the computation that you're performing, not in the same way that you do by adjusting sliders and seeing the numbers line up on the scale dynamically. Okay, there's been a lot of work in so-called embodied interaction, so tangible interfaces for computing. There's some examples here. What sets our system apart, I think, is that it is really it allows people to interact with these devices. Oh, jumping around a bit. It allows people to manipulate these devices much more freely in their environment. And we'll see that here. So here's 3 axes and we can see them operating. Actually, that's a boring GIF. We did a lot of work exploring the different mappings between the dynamics of visualization. So the different known taxonomies of visualization interaction, such as data and view specification and view manipulation, and the input affordances on this device. And we built quite a lot of...
We present the made axis.
Quite a lot of different prototypes of data interaction using these devices. So you can see the sliders, motors, automating them there. We were quite proud of the design. Okay, so here we can use it as a controller in VR. Here we're using it as in combination with a flat flat screen. And here we're using it in an augmented reality environment to do the full kind of IMAX's data manipulation. So we actually did a study here as well. We had pairs of people using the made axes devices to explore a little vehicle data set. This is a classic data set with about 6 different dimensions. So different automobiles, different cars, and their different properties such as weight, acceleration, fuel efficiency, power, number of cylinders, and so on. And we had them explore the data set together and observed how they collaborated, how they communicated, how they used the devices, how they negotiated, how they handed them to each other, and that sort of thing. What we observed was that they were able to use them quite intuitively, and here we're also using it as a VR controller. So we're using it as a controller for the IMAX system in VR. And I might jump ahead a little bit. Yep, and in combination with the flat screen. So they're not specific to VR. The benefits of this kind of embodied interaction carry over to flat screens as well. So it would be kind of fun to have one of these built into a laptop, perhaps. Okay. So I think I should probably wrap up there. And then we'll still have a few minutes for questions, hopefully. I think the emerging topics that I'm becoming very interested in, though, are, so we've built a number of systems and we've evaluated them in terms of how easily people can use them to do data analysis. The work that still needs to be done, and these are some recent studies we see here that are finding interesting use cases of immersive visualization where you find real concrete benefits to working with data in these immersive environments. But I think what we have to do now is more work on understanding this idea of embodying data or embodied data visualization. What does that actually mean? What does embodied sense making mean? How does embodying data in a way that we can use really natural interactions to walk around it and explore it, how does that help us to understand the data? And is it actually, as we've been claiming many times ourselves and other people, is it actually conducive to sense making better, for example, than a flat screen? That's an open question and one that I hope to explore a lot more in future. So perhaps I'll leave it there so that we still have a few minutes for questions. Thank you very much for your attention. If anything exciting happened in the Olympics while I was talking, perhaps you can let me know. So thank you very much. Perhaps I'll hand over to for questions now. Oh, in fact, there's a question right here. Sorry, perhaps I should just jump in and answer this first question.
We can post a few questions.
Yes.
But, yeah, I will bring some. I think there also we have some online discussion group. So some people a small portion of people directly in our Zoom conference, but we also have a large portion of audience. They are watching this is through a broadcast platform called Bilibili. It's like YouTube or something like this one. They gonna send in more questions. So yeah, actually today we have the talk. It's a two-part. First part is kind of actually very smart way of visualize the graphs. The second part, probably a lot of people, even people outside of visualization may be interested in. So like think about how immersive visualization can work. So how about there are some questions from the first part. Maybe we can group the questions in.
So I do have this first question that came in a few minutes ago from Wei Zheng, which was how to do user studies for VR in the current pandemic situation. And that's a really good question and something that we've been grappling with. It has slowed us down in our lab. We've all been working from home a lot the last few months, and we've had to put a lot of studies on hold. Although I do know some people are managing to do quite clever things in terms of, well, firstly, taking headsets home and giving headsets, in some cases, sending headsets by post to experimental participants and having them collaborate, having them perform the experiment from their own home inside the headset. So if you can be organized enough to do that, it's still possible. Of course, there's limitations then. But it's still possible. And in fact, I mean, this is one of the great potentials of headsets is that potentially you can have a very immersive collaborative experience with with other people, but from your own home. So perhaps, you know, that's a real opportunity is to enable remote collaboration, but still allowing people to walk around together and see each other, or at least their avatars in immersive environments. Another question just came in from Ling Yun Yu. What are the main advantages for the tangible interfaces comparing to the traditional interfaces in data manipulation, navigation, and selection? So that's it's a good question. And something that we're still exploring. So I gave some hand wavy ideas before that. Firstly, you get haptic feedback, so you can have these sliders set up to allow you to push back when you slide past certain points of interest in the data, or to snap to nearby features. Whereas with a VR controller, you have no such feedback, right? You don't feel anything as you move the controller around. Perhaps the controller can buzz. We did a study on that actually and found certain advantages to using haptics through the controller buzzing. But with these sliders, you can have much more precise feedback. And we're doing more work on that actually with more sophisticated devices that we can that can give you more degrees of haptic feedback, and I might have to come back to you once we have the results of those studies. Another question, perhaps Wei Zheng is asking these on behalf of people who've been watching the stream. So thank you for this question, whoever asked it. In addition to the works on visualizing inherently 3D data and embodied interactions, could you share some materials or introduce some more works about how people utilize the unlimited 3D space in VR? Which kind of human spatial ability can be leveraged for analyzing data in immersive space? Really, really big questions, which I was sort of starting to allude to, and I don't necessarily have all the answers yet, but I'm certainly in the process of exploring this, designing more studies to explore these. About how people utilize the unlimited 3D space in VR. That's a really interesting question. There was an interesting WIST paper from, oh, actually, this is a good one here. This is from, again, work I did with Yuan Yang, who was my former student, who's now at Virginia Tech. We did this 2 years ago, I think, pre-pandemic. So he was exploring how you can do overview and detail or zooming interfaces to suit 3D data interaction. So, you know, zooming and panning and overview and detail, they're fundamental concepts in traditional desktop visualization, and give you, for example, an infinitely large virtual desktop. So you can zoom in to the point where you can see very fine details in the visualization, but the full visualization goes off the edges of the screen. In the same way, in our VR environments, we can limit how far we need to walk by zooming into points of interest or zooming out using similar kind of gestures as you might on a touch panel. In VR, we experimented with, for example, using the controllers to do gestures like pulling things apart to zoom in, push them back together to zoom out. So yes, it's an unlimited space, but you are limited by your physical environment in how far you can walk. So you need to develop these techniques for navigating around the environment using gestures or other methods. So more work to be done there, but I can point you towards Yulong's paper for a starting point. Okay, and the other part of that question was which kind of human spatial ability can be leveraged for analyzing data in immersive space? So that's an interesting one. Also, a little bit still to be determined. This bottom study here actually is work by my current student, Xiaoru, or Joe, as we call him, who is interested in how to design these kind of small multiple visualizations. So visualizations with lots of small components for exploring multivariate data or multiple engineering diagrams. What's the best layout to use is kind of the simplest way to sum up his question. Should it wrap around you or should it be in a flat wall? And he's got some interesting results there about actually, although things like that Cave 2 environment that I showed you earlier, and despite what we've seen people do in this study here, where they arranged the visualizations around them in a circle, we found that having people rotate a lot to work with the data makes it difficult for them to remember. Well, it impacts their spatial memory. So there's all kinds of we need a better model of how spatial arrangement kind of affects people's abilities. And I think we're starting to see some ideas now, for example, that flat displays and physically walking, even though they make you walk a little bit further, they're less disorienting than a wraparound display. That's one insight I have right now. But I think there's a lot more work to be done there. Okay. Is there time for more questions or have I talked for too long?
Yeah, I think, yeah, probably I don't see furthermore questions pop in. So yeah, probably like if people want to ask more questions, maybe like they can later send an email like directly to you.
Of course, yes, please.
Yeah, actually, immersive analytics is very important, especially like years ago, people like may think 3D it's quite visualization is difficult, and but now like with the advance of those 3D devices, there's quite a lot of possibilities. So maybe let's say a little bit like wrap up. So what kind of your visionary thinking about like in the future for such a kind of immersive analytics? Is there like some new possible hardware could be like used to support some like more interesting visualization, or like in terms of like the wide application? Because now like still for such a like devices, it's especially for the augmented reality devices, it's still quite expensive and limited to a small portion of people. So is there like a possibility such things could be used in a much wider range for general public or for mass use?
Yeah, so it is, the situation is still a moving target. The price of these headsets is at the high end, it's still quite expensive, but there are cheaper headsets that are quite capable, becoming more available. There's probably all sorts in China that I don't even know about. So perhaps if you know of some, you can let me know. But the one that we've been using a lot lately is the Oculus Quest 2, which is really quite a high resolution display. It's got no cable, it's tetherless. It's got a self-contained Android computing device inside it. And so we're using those for example, our most recent collaborative studies. And people are able to walk much more freely without the cable, and the devices are relatively cheap. They're only about, I think, about $500 US. And so it is, they are becoming more accessible. I think they are gradually being used more in gaming. So again, I think, as was the situation in computer graphics, for example, in the 90s and 2000s, I think gaming is probably pushing the technology and spreading its popularity most quickly. But as has happened with for desktops, I think as the graphics being used in games developed, and as people got more comfortable with interacting with graphical displays in games, I think we started seeing more and more graphical user environments being used on desktops. I think the same thing will happen with VR and AR, that gaming and probably things like social media as well. You know, Facebook is investing very heavily into this so-called metaverse. So they're trying to create communication systems and conferencing systems and chat systems in these immersive environments. So I think that will broaden the adoption of these immersive devices. So I think it's important that as researchers, we keep doing this research, and we are ready for when they are truly mainstream, and perhaps it's common that people have VR or AR headsets in their workplace. I think we need to be ready to have the techniques to do data visualization available for those people. And in terms of the direction of research, one thing that this notion of embodied sense making is something that I'm very interested in at the moment, and I'm actually writing grant applications at the moment to work with psychologists and even philosophers who are interested in these questions, cognitive psychologists who have much more expertise in actually how human beings cognitive processes work, and how our cognitive processes are related to our physical movement and interaction with the space around us. So I'm looking forward to doing more controlled studies to help build better models for how sense making can be improved with these kind of embodied interfaces. So that's something that excites me at the moment and for the future.
Yeah, great. Thanks for the sharing. I I believe there are gonna be more and more people coming to this area, and we're gonna see more exciting work. Yeah, actually now it's already 8:35 in Beijing time. So we have a great talk today. Thank you very much. Yeah, so
thank you again for having me.
Yeah, but yeah, it's always it's a little bit difficult for the online talk. We don't have too much interaction between audience and yeah, our speakers. But we hope like the COVID-19 gonna be like a situation gonna be better. So maybe like next year or something, we could have some physically invite you in some.
Thank you very much. I would very much enjoy that, and I would also advertise that the IEEE-VIS conference is going to be in Melbourne in 2023. So so you are all welcome to come and attend that conference next year, and hopefully there's no more pandemics, or the pandemic situation is resolved by then and everybody's free to travel, in which case we'll be very happy to welcome you to Melbourne.
Yeah, yes, yeah, sure. We really hope like we can like make a physical travel over there, so we don't need to do it in cyberspace. So yeah, thank you. Great.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks for sharing. Yeah, actually online there's more than 1,000 like accumulated people. I think it's 1,300 some around in our broadcast system, and yeah, we have quite a good audience. Yeah, although like still the spring festival. So let me take 1 more minute. Let me give a little kind of a forecast for our next after 2 weeks of our talk. So that's okay. Yeah, so our next talk, we're gonna invite John Stesko, professor from Georgia Tech. His talk gonna be designing flexible and nature interface for human data interaction. The time gonna be February 24th. That's in the morning because John is from US. So the morning 9 o'clock to 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock to 10:30. So welcome everyone. And we also post the code there. If someone want to join the discussion group, you can scan the code and join the discussion. So thank you everyone who are watching this this talk, and let's thank again to Professor Tim Dwyer. So have a good time for the Spring Festival. Thank you.